pretty good. So, I'd like to welcome you all to this fantastic evening here at Kehillat Israel Reconstructionist Congregation of Pacific Palisades. Some of you come very far, really far. Some of you have come from across the world to be here. We're pleased for that. Some of you have come from Bend, Oregon to be here. We have people here from on the other side of Los Angeles who are complaining because it's so hard to get here and it's a schlep and, you know, and we understand, and so we're privileged that you took the time and effort and showed up tonight. It's looking forward to this very special evening. An evening on anti-Semitism doesn't always sound like having a good time exactly, I must say, but here as we are, the Jewish world commemorating the 75th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and also in the last Russia, Ukraine, I guess really technically. Some of you may remember, I was just thinking about different outstanding anti-Semitic experiences like the Dreyfus trial and things, and the Bayless trial 100 years ago was very dramatic. It was a blood libel trial, in case you hadn't heard of it. Menachem Mendel Bayless, who was accused of murdering a Christian child and using his blood for Passover matzah, which is usually what blood libels are about. And of course it wasn't true, and not only wasn't it true, but after 2 years of being in prison and eventually having a trial, he was actually found not guilty because it was, even at the time, the alleged experts and witnesses against him were so ridiculous that even the anti-Semitic, although they wouldn't have called it then, anti-Jewish members of the jury couldn't bring themselves to convict him. But this is an issue that for the Jewish community, of course, is long-standing, the whole area of anti-Semitism, which of course itself, I guess, is a misnomer. Anti-Semitism, it's really anti-Jewishism would be better as far as I'm concerned. But we're privileged to have an expert this evening, a very special guest. I'm not going to introduce. I'm going to allow Robert Resnick to introduce. But we appreciate you being here. We thank you for the guests of yours that you have brought with you. We encourage you to come anytime. We want you to know that every one of our services, and including this, all of our experiences here are streamed live on our website. So those of you who are in Sweden or anywhere else in the world, you can always feel a part of KI by simply logging onto our website when we're having anything, and you can participate and bring us into your home. This evening came about because of Robert Resnick, not only a longtime member of KI, but more importantly, a longtime leader of KI, member of the board for more years almost than I'm alive, and chair of our real estate committee, and the man who was responsible for redoing our bylaws. So if things aren't working at KI, we can always blame Robert because he rewrote the bylaws, and is just one of the great, outstanding leaders of this synagogue and this community. So I'm going to give Robert Resnick the great privilege of introducing our guest speaker.
Hello, everybody. This one? Okay. There's a choice. It's like the old story about two Jews in a room. There's always three opinions. Well, there's very tough to choose. Okay. Very warm welcome to everybody here, and to the Swedes, very hjärtlig välkommen. This is a very special night for me in many ways, to be able to bring my Swedish friends and those that I have enjoyed and shared so many life experiences with into our home for many reasons. Sweden has enjoyed a wonderful, close, and very important relationship with the Jewish community for centuries and centuries, and Lund University, as much as any other place in Sweden, characterizes that relationship in many ways. Beginning way back when Lund was formed in 1666, its beginning preparations to celebrate its 350th year jubileum anniversary. It's a school of 47,000 students. It ranks, I think, 66 in the top-ranked 1,000 universities in the world. And the story of the relationship between Lund University and the Jewish people is a story that is really untold and I think really needs to be told. Southern Sweden, where Lund is located, was the place that many of the Jews who were escaping central continental Europe and exiting Denmark after the Nazi occupation were accepted with open arms and allowed to come and live freely and become a part of Swedish society. And Lund today operates the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, which teaches and exports human rights, international law. It's headed by Marie Tuma, who is a former judge in the criminal courts of The Hague, who herself has tried many Holocaust war crimes and is very passionate about human rights and the rights of Jews. Lund also houses the Ravensbrück archives, which was sort of its own local form of the Shoah project that's been sponsored and put together by Steven Spielberg. In 1946, one of the professors at Lund began translating, but I guess, translating, and archiving and assembling the diaries and the papers and the stories of many of the Polish immigrants to Sweden who came out of the Ravensbrück concentration camp after they were liberated. Lund also operates the Swedish Theological Institute in Jerusalem, which not many know about, but is a wonderful bridge for clergy and people of faith from Sweden to come and experience Israel and learn more about the Judeo-Christian relationship. And the program tonight is brought to you not only by Lund University, but also by the Lund University Foundation, which is a group that's been put together to bring more information about Lund to America, to rekindle ties with American alumni of Lund University, and of course, as we all do, to raise money for its programs, to continue doing what it does and operating these very, very important programs. I'd like to introduce some guests in the audience. Göran Eriksson. Göran is the president of the Lund University Foundation. We have Sven Strömqvist, who is the vice president of the University for Research. He gets mad at me when I say this, but that's kind of like the vice chancellor, but we can't say vice chancellor because their chancellor is called vice chancellor. A little complicated, but Sven's a big guy and a very important guy at the university. And we have Ulrika Nilsson, who's the director of development at Lund University and the executive director of Lund University Foundation. A little bit more about Lund. It has created many of the inventions and the things that we take for granted over the years. It has a booming medical and scientific research program. It has a strategic partnership with Stanford University. And some of the inventions and the enhancements of our lives that we take for granted that came out of Lund are Bluetooth, laser cancer treatment in the artificial kidney. And with that, I'm going to introduce our very special guest speaker for tonight. Professor Jesper Svartvik, to me, I've had the pleasure of getting to know Jesper over a period of time now, and he truly personifies the age-old adage, speak softly, but carry a big club. And Jesper's club is his vast knowledge, his scholarly work, and his commitment to human rights and to the rights of the people of Israel and the Jewish community. He's an ordained priest in the Lutheran Church of Sweden. He is a full professor in Lund's School of Theology. He is a professor at the Swedish Theological Institute in Jerusalem. He's a great scholar with many books published. I think he's publishing his sixth book now. And the focus of his studies and his scholarly work and his teaching is Judeo-Christian relations. In fact, Jesper wrote his doctoral thesis on kashrut. Think of that. And taught me the symbolism of applying the tefillin last week or a few days ago in New York. Jesper is also a true friend of the State of Israel and the worldwide Jewish community. He's a former chair of the Swedish Committee Against Anti-Semitism. He stands up for what's right in the world. When he's teaching at the Swedish Theological Institute, he leads regular tours of Yad Vashem for international clergy. After Jesper's speech, Rabbi Rubin will come up and help moderate questions. And with that, it's my great privilege and a pleasure to introduce to you Professor Jesper Svartvik.
Thank you very much. Shilchu vaesh miktashecha, la'aretz shilchilelu mishkan shmecha, amru v'libam ninam yachad, safur chol moadei el ba'aretz. They burnt your sanctuary to the ground, they defiled the dwelling place of your name. They said in their hearts, we will crush them completely. They burnt every place where God was worshipped in the land. Coming Saturday, coming Shabbat, exactly 75 years have passed since the Kristallnacht, and the words from Tehillim that I just quoted lend a voice to all those humiliated, beaten, detained, and murdered. All over Germany and Austria, Jewish sanctuaries were set on fire and burned to the ground, and the message was quite clear, as in the words 75 years ago, the 74th Psalm, we will crush them completely. The Kristallnacht is often called the final rehearsal of the Nazis' final solution, the Endlösung der Judenfrage. And 75 years later, we remember the dead, we honor the survivors, and we also recommit ourselves to fighting anti-Semitism. What can we do? What should we do? What must we do? And one would think that a world war with 55 million dead and a systematic genocide of 6 million of the Jewish people, out of which 1 million were children, yes, one would think that anti-Semitism would never again rise. One would think that it had vanished from the surface of the earth, never to appear again. But those who assume this are quite simply wrong. Jews in Europe, in the Middle East and elsewhere not only experience anti-Semitism, they experience that anti-Semitism is rising. And let me share with you a few facts tonight from a recent survey from 9 European countries. A quarter of the respondents said that they avoid visiting places or wearing symbols that identify them as Jews for fear of anti-Semitism. Fear of wearing a kippah or other identifiable Jewish items is especially strong in Sweden. 49% of the respondents said that they refrained from such actions, according to a year-long survey conducted from September 2012 to September 2013, among more than 5,100 Jews interviewed by the European Union Agency for Fundamental Rights. And one week every year, I teach pro bono at an Institute for Jewish Studies in Stockholm, the capital of Sweden. So I've seen this. I've seen how men remove the kippah, the kippot, and how women put the Magen David inside their top before leaving the building, the Jewish center in Stockholm. In France, 40% of approximately 1,200 Jews said they avoid wearing such items in public, followed by Belgium, 36%, and in total, 22% of the respondents said they avoid Jewish events and Jewish sites. This is Europe today. 22%, more than every fifth person, said they avoid not only wearing a kippah in public, not only wearing a Magen David, but even avoiding a Jewish event and a Jewish site. That is what is going on in Europe today. A few years ago, I participated in a conference in Cordoba in southern Spain, organized by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, OSCE. You may have heard of this organization. And there are two statements in the Cordoba Declaration from the conference that are of particular importance for us today. First of all, in this document it's stated that it's necessary, quote, to recognize that some forms of intolerance and discrimination may have unique characteristics and origins, end of quote. And I think that's very, very important. What's emphasized here is that we have good reasons to pay particular attention to some forms of stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination. It's of course, needless to say, it's of course always wrong to loathe people, but some, simply because out of historical reasons, some forms of loathing are even more dangerous than other forms, because they have, quote, unique characteristics and origins, end of quote. And anti-Semitism is such a phenomenon. And therefore, we all have to pay it. They have a peculiar, particular potential to destroy and hurt. And I think of anti-Semitism not only as a lack of knowledge, as a pothole, if you like, in the road. It's a shortage of something. And if you just add something, if you add knowledge, you won't have the problem. I think that anti-Semitism is part of Europe's cultural heritage. To use the same kind of metaphor, it's a bump on the road, if you like. In order to drive there safely, you will have to remove something, and that's so much more difficult. If you think of something just to add knowledge, well, you say it, and then there is no longer a pothole on the street. But if there's a bump there, you have to remove it. And anti-Semitism is part of Europe's legacy, Europe's cultural heritage. It's there. Europe is the continent where Christianity has been for 2,000 years. And only a few decades ago, Europe was immune to ordinary decency. So there's something in Europe that is deeply, deeply disturbing and deeply, deeply wrong. So what is it that we can do then? Speaking as a European coming to your community tonight, what is it that we can do? And the most important word I can think of is education. The second point in the Cordoba Declaration I thought of that I wanted to share with you tonight is that it says that anti-Semitism can never be excused by referring to the political situation in Israel or in other parts of the Middle East. And that's also important because in Europe today, the discourse, the anti-Jewish discourse, has an anti-Israeli tone and tenure. What this statement says, that it's always wrong to give vent to anti-Semitism. whatever may happen in the Middle East. Or in other words, it's always right to combat anti-Semitism and other forms of racism. It's that easy, and nevertheless, it's so very difficult. In a book by Walter Laqueur, The Changing Face of Anti-Semitism, he has a statement that I often think of. And he says like this: Hitler gave anti-Semitism a bad name. And there's a widespread reluctance on the part of even the most severe critics of the Jews to accept this label. So although we no doubt encounter anti-Semitism in Europe and other parts of the world, there are no anti-Semites today. I mean, if you read literature from the early 20th century, you meet a lot of proud anti-Semites. They write anti-Semitism and they call themselves anti-Semites, and they are mighty proud of it. But we don't see that today, which means that we have a problem, but we don't have the terminology. And the rabbi referred to this. So what are we talking about when we're talking about anti-Semitism? And a lot of people want to redefine the word, saying that it means something else. Anti-Semitism was coined by those who wanted to hate Jews, and that is what it's all about. So we have anti-Semitism, but strangely enough today we don't have any anti-Semites. Those who spurn Jews and Judaism do not call themselves anti-Semites. And this is something we have to understand, and therefore I will repeat it once again. Those who today spurn Jews and Judaism on a regular basis, always, they don't call themselves anti-Semites. And if you confront them with this, they will immediately say, I'm not an anti-Semite. Here, hence, we have a problem, and it's quite easy to detect this problem, but we can't use the usual label, anti-Semitism. I don't know if you've read a book by David Nirenberg that was recently published, a big book, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, in which he explores the extraordinary place of Judaism in the history of thought itself. I read it this summer. It took me a long time because it's not only has a lot of information, but it gives you a lot of food for thought. So he continues by saying, anti-Semitism is not simply an attitude towards the action of real Jews and their religion. It's a way of critically engaging the world. It's a way to critically engaging the world. So what does he mean when he says that? It means that people want to overcome something. They see a problem, and people tend to call the old stage that you want to replace something that has to do with Judaism. So it's an overcoming of Judaism. It has the capacity to introduce Judaism in whatever it criticizes. And I know I'm repeating myself here, but what I see in Europe today, that there are no anti-Semites, but there are people who always talk about that there is something deeply problematic with Jews and Judaism. I ask my students, when I see their reports, their papers, their essays, their exams, is Judaism a life to be lived or a problem to be solved? And they've never heard that before, because for so many people outside of the Jewish world, Judaism tends to be a problem to be solved. It's something that's wrong in the Hebrew Bible that has to be fixed in the New Testament. There's something that's problematic in what scholars used to call late Judaism, Spätjudentum in German, that has to be fixed in the newer era. That is why I think David Nirenberg is so, unfortunately, that he's so correct when he says it's a way of critically engaging the world, because it's some kind of overcoming, replacing the old with something new. So all those people who say that they oppose stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination, tribalism, egotism, slandering, patriarchal structures, yes, even those who say that they refute anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, racism, these people tend to refer to something that used to be there but no longer ought to be there. They refer to Judaism in the Hebrew Bible, they refer to the Pharisees in the New Testament, and this is something that has to be opposed and one has to overcome. I could say a lot about Nierenberg's book because it's so thought-provoking, but I just wanted to mention this, and I'll continue with other aspects of this. And that is towards the end of the book, when he reaches the Third Reich era, and we see that Jewishness continued to not be limited to real Jews, but it's all over. Even those in the history of Europe who have never met Jews, they know so much about Jews. They have never read books about Judaism, and yet they know so much about this religion. It's a very odd phenomenon. You heard in the introduction that I'm ordained, and I think that if many of my colleagues were asked, could you give a presentation of Hinduism or Buddhism or Islam? A lot of them would say, I can't do that because I don't read Sanskrit, or I don't know Arabic, or I haven't visited the Muslim world. I can't really do that. You have to ask someone else. But if I ask them to say something about Judaism, immediately they will pop up in the pulpit and say a lot of things about Judaism. Although they have never met Jews, they don't know anything about living Judaism today. That is the problem. That is what makes the Jewish-Christian connection so unique. I don't like to use the word unique because you can't say that something is pretty unique or rather unique. But in the wide variety of this landscape of interreligious relation, there is something unique about the Jewish-Christian encounter, because a Christian cannot but relate to Judaism. Christians read the Hebrew Bible in every service. And if I had a colleague who spoke about Islam in every single sermon and said something bad about Islam, that it's so good that Christianity is there because Islam is such a threat, I'm quite sure that the bishop in this priest's diocese would call him or her and say, we need to talk. But if a person talks about Judaism and Jews and Pharisees in sermon after sermon after sermon, year after year, the bishop won't call, because this is something that Christians have been doing for 2,000 years. They drag Jews and Judaism into the service. They drag them into the homilies and into the lectionaries and into the prayer books and into the theological seminaries. Christians are obsessed with this. They talk about Judaism all the time, and as Nierenberg said, it's a kind of overcoming. You need the dark background in order to have the light, this Son of York, as Shakespeare said, the Son, S-O-N or the S-U-N in the New Testament. You need that. For the sun to shine, you need a very dark background. It doesn't have to be this way, but this is the way that it has to be, that it has been. So going back to Nierenberg's book, when he says, so how then should one look upon what happened in the 1930s and the 1940s? And he said, I'm not claiming that the long history of thinking with and about the Jewish question inevitably led to or caused the final solution. Quite the contrary, although he focuses on Germany, the habits or thoughts that he had been describing are widespread throughout Europe and the United States. In other words, the anti-Jewish tradition is not a sufficient condition. I don't know if you've heard this expression before, but it's not all it takes for something to happen. But then he continues saying, but he does believe that the Shoah is inconceivable and is unexplainable without the deep history of thought that he surveys in his book. We will fail to understand those terrors of their effect if we sunder them from what came before. And therefore, he says, it's a necessary condition, which means that if you take away, if one could, if you took away 2,000 years of a teaching of contempt in Europe, he's saying that the Shoah would not have happened. And it's a strange feeling for me to stand here in a synagogue today, being a Lutheran minister from Europe, saying this, that there is something deeply problematic in the history and ideology of Europe that surfaces today. As I said in the beginning, one would think that a world war with 55 million dead, that would make us immune against this. But as I told you about this survey in the beginning, it's not only is it there, but it's rising. And you heard in the beginning of the introduction, the beautiful introduction here, that I now live in Jerusalem. I very often hear French now in the neighborhood where I live. I didn't hear that a couple of years ago because people are leaving France. People are leaving some areas of Sweden, moving to other areas, and I know that some of them have even moved to Israel. So this is what is going on in Europe today. So to conclude this part, anti-Judaism is part of the most ancient collective hatred in the world. It's a cultural phenomenon in Europe, in the Christian world or the post-Christian world, but the area in this world where Christianity has been for 2,000 years. So what we need is a self-critically wishing to detect Judeophobia. And I return to this question that I posed to my students. Is Judaism, its texts, its tradition, adherence, etc., are they presented as a problem to be solved or a life to be lived? And if they say the first thing, there is something deeply problematic there. This overcoming. You remember Nuremberg's statement. It's overcoming. You see something and you say it's problematic. And you have to overcome it. And that's when Christianity comes along. Because Christians early on in church history saw themselves as the new Israel. So what does that make of a community like this? In Latin, the vetus Israel, the old Israel, very often it becomes the versus Israel, against Israel. Because if you're talking about someone in the past tense, you are not relating to it as a contemporary phenomenon. I'd like to share with you 3 phenomena that I see all the time in the ideologies in Europe, and I would say that it goes back to early Christian theology. I know that I'm talking a lot about Christianity here, but that's because I think of Europe as a continent that was forged, in pun intended here, forged so much by this kind of theology. And I take this from a book by Katharina von Kellenbach on anti-Judaism, feminist religious writings. And she says that anti-Judaism is a coherent belief system. You remember my metaphor. It's not a matter of a pothole on the road, it's a bump. And she says that this bump has been there for 2,000 years. It's not something that someone says by accident. It's a coherent belief system. And she gave me 3 words, and I had been thinking so much about that. And when I read the book, I realized that this is what I see all the time when I read the students' papers, when I read newspapers, when I meet Jews and they tell me what they experience in Sweden. So she says there are 3 motifs here, and the first one she calls scapegoating, and especially the D-side charge, but the scapegoating. And it's appropriate to begin with this because it thinks of Jews and Judaism as a scapegoat. It's so fundamental to Christian anti-Judaism, something that's bad, destructive, repressive, oppressive, evil, etc., etc. Whatever you don't like, you'll find it in Judaism, and therefore you have to overcome it. And the odd thing is, therefore, that liberal Christians find something in Spätjudentum they don't like, and conservative Christians find something in late Judaism they don't like. And these 2 images of what Judaism was at the time of Otto Haisch, they don't mix, you can't combine them, but there's something wrong with it. That's what makes the Spätjudentum so practical, so convenient. I searched the internet when I prepared this speech. I looked at the internet for quote, "The Jews kill Jesus," end of quote. And I got hundreds of thousands of hits. Then I searched, "The Italians kill Jesus," and I got very, very few hits, whereas that would be, historically speaking, much more to the point. I read when I prepared this that the Anti-Defamation League recently had a centennial poll saying that 26% of Americans today believe that the Jews killed Jesus. 26%, and I'm not talking about Europe now, but even here in this multicultural society of the United States. I even got a website that was called www.jewskilljesus.com. I never entered it because it made me so tired. So I don't know what's there, but obviously someone thinks that's a very good website, very good name for a website. That's the first motif she talks about. Then I wanted to say something about the second one, and that is what she calls the antithesis, the contrast, that you find something that's important to yourself, and then you have to find what's bad in the dark background. So a good Lutheran would talk about the grace of God and see that the opposite of that would be the law, or halakha, or the Torah. But how then do you translate into good English or good Swedish the sentence in Mishle where it says that she has, what is it? Torat chesed al leshona. She has the loving kindness of the Torah on her tongue. But if Torah is the bad word in some Christian theologies, that law is something that you have to get rid of in order to grace to abound, what do you do with such a sentence in Mishle? I've been teaching so many students in Lund and in Jerusalem. I've been talking about various groups during the late Second Temple period, about Sadducees, and the students write because they know that this will be on the exam. And I say a few words about the Essenes, and they keep writing because they think this will be on the exam. And I talk about the chief priests and the zealots and the Herodians, and they keep writing. And then I say a few words about the Pharisees, and there's always one in the group who puts down his or her pen, looking at me with eyes like ping pong balls and saying, if the Pharisees were like that, why then would Jesus have to come? Do you see this overcoming theology that's deep down there? It's just a tip of an iceberg, but it's there, and I would be a very rich person if I got a little penny every time I've heard that, every time I've encountered that. So if I say something about a group that is being described in the New Testament in a way that sometimes gives vent to some kind of tension, and I describe it as historians and theologians want to describe the Pharisees today, it is a theological problem because they tend to present, they want to present the historical context of Jesus as his theological contrast. And if you talk about it as a context and not as a contrast, it's a theological problem. It's an existential problem to them. Why else would he have to come? So those were a few words about antitheses. The third motif Katharina von Kellenbach talks about is also very influential. That's the entire supersessionism motif, the prologuing of the other, talking about Judaism as something passé, that ceased to exist 2,000 years ago, which means that Adam is good and Noah is good, and King David and Solomon are good, and Moses is good. All those characters, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Yechezkel, all those important persons are good. When it comes to the Second Temple period, it's no longer interesting. And it's so odd that when a colleague of mine at Lund University wrote a question at an exam saying, when did the Jews celebrate Sukkot? And a student came to me and said, so what am I supposed to do here? When did Jews celebrate Sukkot? And I said, you should have written last September. That would be, or last October. That would be that. But they think of Judaism something passé. And I see the students writing, and they may come from, may have a very Christian background, or they may have a more secular background. They may want to become teachers, so they don't know a lot about it, but they still talk about Judaism in the past tense. Which means that when they talk about the scholar who says something about Judaism, and this scholar now is deceased, if I take Rudolf Bultmann, a German theologian who is no longer among us. So a student can write, Rudolf Bultmann argues that Judaism was, whereas it should be the other way around. Don't you agree? You should say that Rudolf Bultmann used to argue, used to write, used to say that Judaism is. So that's why, once again, it's such a privilege to be here tonight in a Jewish context. When I visited Rome and I went to the Ark of Titus, I wanted to see the menorah there, and I met a Jewish family with kippot and everything pointing at a small inscription. Someone had written, Am Yisrael Chai. So, you know, it depicts how the treasures were taken out of the temple, but someone had written today, Am Yisrael Chai. And that is so, so, so important for my students to understand. And that's why it's not a pothole, but it's the bump. It's not only something you need to know, there's something you have to unlearn as well. Those are three motifs that I meet all the time, and I wanted to share this with you because it says something about how close Judaism and Christianity, the Jewish and Christian traditions, are together. For better, for worse, well, in sickness and in health, but seldom to love and to cherish, I'm sure, that they are so related. You can't enter a Christian service without hearing a lot of Hebrew words. There will be Hallelujah and Hosanna and Amen. So Christianity began as a Jewish movement, and therefore it constantly refers to Judaism. And if you think of it, if you think that you don't have to think about it, it will be a bad hermeneutics. It will for sure be a bad theology. I don't know if you've heard of Mikalovsky. Some of you may have heard of him, may have read about him in a book, for example, published by Joel Marcus a couple of years ago. I bought it in the Vatican, of all places, a book about Zvi Mikalovsky. Zvi Mikalovsky and all the other Jews from the village of Esiski in Lithuania, they were forced into the forest to dig a deep ditch on September 25th, 1941. And then one after one, they were shot. Zvi Mikalovsky, he counted the seconds between every shot, and only seconds before it was his turn to be murdered, he threw himself into the ditch, lying there all day long. And in the evening, when the murderers thought that there were no Jews left in the entire village and went home,